My wife betrayed me and took my child away from me. When I married another woman, we worked together at the same job, and we started receiving threatening letters. They wanted to us. I had worked as a private investigator for over 15 years, having transitioned from a police officer to running my own agency. The skills I picked up on the force helped me build a successful business, allowing me to take on a few cases at a time, maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and work at my own pace. By the time I turned 40, I had been divorced for a little over a year. My marriage to Jennifer had barely lasted past its first year. I wasn't having trouble meeting women. Being financially stable and reasonably good-looking kept the dating pool open. But deep down, I wasn't looking for anything serious anymore. Jennifer, my ex-wife, was around my age, attractive, and ambitious. We dated for about a year before she convinced me to take a spontaneous trip to Boston, where we ended up getting married. Honestly, I wasn't sure why I went through with it. I liked her well enough, but love was never truly a part of it. Maybe I felt like it was time to settle down. After the wedding, Jennifer moved into my townhouse. It was a great place: pool, sauna, hot tub, fireplace, everything you could ask for. Jennifer, before meeting me, lived in a small apartment and worked as a stylist in a modest salon. She always talked about opening her own business, and after about a month of marriage, I helped her realize that dream. I bought her a 4-chair salon. She hired a couple of friends, and her business was up and running. I didn't pay much attention to her salon's progress after that. From what I gathered, it seemed to be doing well. One Saturday, she told me she had appointments lined up all day, so I didn't expect her home until late. I was working on a case of my own, tracking a cheating spouse, but since I was nearby her salon, I figured I'd stop by to use the restroom. When I arrived, I saw the closed sign on the door. It wasn't odd, given that it was later in the day, so I let myself in, planning to quickly use the bathroom and head out. As I walked through the salon, I heard noises coming from her office. It was the unmistakable sound of two people who weren't just working. My stomach turned. I approached the office door, which was slightly ajar, and pulled out my gun, just out of habit as a precaution. I swung the door open. There she was, Jennifer, my wife of less than a year, her skirt hiked up, sitting on another man's lap. Jennifer screamed when she saw me, but her lover pushed her off and scrambled to pull up his pants. I walked toward him and pistol-whipped him across the face, leaving a mark on his cheek. I told him to get out, and if I ever saw him again, it wouldn't end as nicely. He bolted out the door without another word. Jennifer, sobbing and trying to compose herself, started with, "It's not what it looks like." I cut her off. "It's exactly what it looks like. We're done. You've got 1 hour to pack your things and get out of my house. Leave the key on the kitchen table. If anything of yours is still there when I get home, it's going out the window." With that, I turned and left, heading straight to my friend Kyle's house. Kyle was a lawyer, and we had been friends since our police academy days. I told him everything that had just happened. "I want a divorce as soon as possible," I said. "She can keep the damn salon. That's probably why she married me in the first place." I had a prenuptial agreement in place, so there wasn't much Jennifer could claim besides what I offered. Kyle called her while she was still packing her things, and after hearing the terms, she agreed without a fight. A few weeks later, the divorce was finalized. I learned that she had gotten back together with her ex-boyfriend, the same guy I found her with. After the paperwork was signed, I never saw either of them again. It wasn't long before I was back to business, working on another case involving a cheating wife. My client had hired me to follow his wife, who claimed she was going on a business trip with her boss. Of course, it was a lie. They were staying in a hotel, sharing a room, and I had set up surveillance equipment to catch them in the act. That evening, I sat in the hotel bar, waiting for morning when I'd collect my footage and wrap up the case. As I sat there, nursing a drink, a young woman approached me. She was dressed provocatively, clearly nervous. Before I could respond, the hotel manager swooped in. "We don't allow solicitation here," he said sternly, directing his words toward her. Thinking quickly, I stood up. "You're late," I said, making it seem like she was with me. The manager hesitated, apologized, and walked away, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The woman thanked me and sat down, explaining that she wasn't used to this being selling herself. Her name was Ava, But after a bit of conversation, she revealed that her real name was Grace. She told me she needed money to take care of her daughter, but she was clearly new to the streets and didn't know what to charge. I offered her $300 to come up to my room. Not for anything sexual, just to talk. Grace was hesitant but agreed. Once we were in my room, she unbuttoned her blouse. But I stopped her. That's not what I'm paying you for. Just sit down and let's talk. She seemed confused but relieved. As the conversation continued, she opened up about her struggles. Grace had lost her job, her health insurance, and her daughter's medical bills were piling up. Desperate, she had turned to selling herself, though this was her first night on the streets. She told me about her life, how she had been a ward of the state since she was 8 after her parents were arrested for drug dealing. Her father had been killed in prison, and she hadn't heard from her mother since. She bounced between foster homes, never staying anywhere long enough to form meaningful relationships. After high school, she ran away with her boyfriend, got pregnant, and when he left her, she was left raising their daughter, Emma, alone. It was clear that Grace was in over her head, and I felt compelled to help her. I gave her more money and told her I'd help her find a better way to support herself and her daughter. The next morning, I left her some clothes I had bought and promised I'd be in touch. After a few days, I made some calls and found out more about her past. Everything she told me was true. Her life had been tough, but she was trying her best to stay afloat. I decided to help her get back on her feet and offered her a job at my agency. She was hesitant at first, but eventually accepted. Over the next few months, Grace settled into the office, learning the ropes and proving herself capable. My sister, Lisa, who had worked with me for years, took to Grace immediately. They became close, and even though Lisa had been wary of Jennifer from the start, she gave Grace her full approval. Grace's daughter, Emma, also became a regular at the office. She was a sweet kid, and over time, I grew attached to both her and Grace. We spent more time together outside of work, and eventually, I realized I had developed feelings for Grace. But I kept those feelings to myself, unsure if she felt the same way or if it was appropriate, given how much I had helped her. One day, while looking into Grace's past to make sure everything was above board, I discovered that her ex, Matthew, was Emma's biological father. He had assaulted Grace years earlier, but she had kept it a secret. Matthew was now a successful businessman, about to receive an award for his contributions to the community. I knew I had to confront him, not just for Grace but for Emma's sake as well. I arranged a meeting with Matthew at his office. He was arrogant, the type of guy who believed his money and connections would protect him. I laid out the facts. I knew about the assault, and I knew he was Emma's father. I demanded that he sign over his parental rights and provide financial support for Emma's medical care. At first, he threatened to sue me for blackmail, but I stood my ground. He eventually agreed, knowing that a public scandal would ruin his reputation. I left his office with a cashier's check for $50,000 and a signed document relinquishing his parental rights. When I gave Grace the news, she broke down in tears, thanking me for everything I had done. We grew even closer after that, and I finally gathered the courage to ask her out on a real date. A few months later, I proposed, and she said yes without hesitation. Emma was thrilled to have a family, and we got married in a small ceremony surrounded by our friends and family. The years that followed were some of the best of my life. Grace and I worked together at the agency, and Emma quickly became the center of our world. We watched her grow, celebrated her milestones, and enjoyed the quiet moments as a family. My life with Grace and Emma was more than I ever could have imagined. In the end, it wasn't the cases I solved, the money I made, or the things I owned that mattered. It was the love I had found, the family we had created, and the life we built together. For the first time in my life, I felt truly content. As the years went by, life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. While my work as a private investigator kept me busy, the most significant changes came through Grace and her daughter, Emma. Once Grace became a part of my life, everything took on a new rhythm, something far more rewarding than the cases I handled. Grace had come a long way from the nervous woman I met in that hotel bar. At first, she doubted herself in the office, unsure if she belonged in the world of private investigations. But with time, she proved to be sharp, quick to learn, and invaluable in running the agency. Lisa, my sister, had taken her under her wing, and the two became fast friends, more like sisters than co-workers. It was good to see. Grace needed support, and Lisa had always thrived on helping others, especially since she'd been taking care of me after our parents passed away. Emma was growing up fast, and she was thriving in school. She'd come home every day with stories about her new friends or something exciting she learned in class. She was a bright, energetic kid who quickly became the center of my world. My favorite part of the day was coming home after a long shift to hear her excited chatter. Grace and I would sit with her, helping her with homework or just watching her play. For the first time, I felt what it was like to be part of a real family. One day, Emma surprised me by casually calling me Dad while asking for help with her math homework. I was sitting in the living room when she walked in and said, "Dad, can you help me with this?" The word caught me off guard. I glanced at her, and it was as if the world paused. Grace, who was in the kitchen, looked up and smiled, but Emma didn't seem to notice the significance of what she had said. To her, it was completely natural. To me, it was everything. That single word made me realize how deep our bond had grown. I wasn't just some man in her life. I was her father now. That moment cemented something between us, and from then on, Emma and I became even closer. It wasn't just Grace and me working together to raise her. I was now officially a dad, and it felt like the final piece of my life had fallen into place. At the agency, things were moving smoothly. Grace became more involved in every aspect of the business, handling client meetings, organizing case files, and even accompanying me on a few investigations. She had a natural ability to read people and pick up on subtle clues, something that made her an asset during interviews and stakeouts. One case that sticks out involved a wealthy businessman who suspected his wife of having an affair. He wanted concrete proof before proceeding with a divorce. It was a high-stakes case that required a lot of discretion. Grace and I spent days following the wife, setting up surveillance, and gathering evidence. It was tough work, but we worked well together. Grace had an intuitive sense for the little details others might miss, and her insights often made the difference. One night, while parked outside a luxury hotel, we were waiting for the right moment to collect evidence. The rain poured down, making it difficult to see clearly through the windshield. Grace was sitting in the passenger seat, scribbling notes in her notebook, the dim glow of the dashboard light casting a soft shadow on her face. I couldn't help but look at her and marvel at how much she had changed from the scared young woman I had met all those years ago. Noticing me staring, she asked, "What's going on?" "Just thinking about how far you've come," I said. She smiled. "For better or worse?" "For the better," I said without hesitation. The case ended with us gathering enough evidence for our client to confront his wife. And although it wasn't the happy ending he might have hoped for, he was grateful for our professionalism. It reminded me that, despite the difficult truths we uncovered, our work had a purpose. At home, Emma was blossoming, and life was good. Grace and I had fallen into a routine that was both comfortable and fulfilling. We had our fair share of disagreements, like any couple, but nothing we couldn't work through. The love and commitment we shared made everything worthwhile. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Grace and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. The stars were out, and the peaceful sound of crickets filled the silence. Grace rested her head on my shoulder as we sat quietly together. "Do you ever wonder where we'd be if we hadn't met?" she asked softly. I thought about it for a moment. "I try not to," I replied, "because I don't like the idea of not having you and Emma in my life." Grace smiled and snuggled closer. "It's funny how things work out, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said. "It really is." The agency continued to grow as our reputation spread. We started taking on bigger and more complex cases, and soon enough, we needed to hire additional staff to keep up with the demand. Grace managed the office, ensuring everything ran smoothly, and I handled the fieldwork. Lisa took on more responsibility too, overseeing some of the newer staff, and between the three of us, the agency became one of the most well-respected in town. Then came the case that changed everything. A man walked into our office one day, claiming his brother had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. The police had ruled it a suicide, but our client wasn't convinced. He believed his brother had been murdered, and he suspected foul play within the family. It was a delicate situation, one that had the potential to make or break the agency. We spent weeks investigating the family, uncovering secrets that had been buried for years. Grace was instrumental in the process, using her empathy and sharp mind to connect with people and draw out information. In the end, we were able to prove that the brother had indeed been murdered, and the police reopened the case. Our client was beyond grateful, and the success of that investigation cemented our reputation as one of the top agencies in the city. Despite the success at work, the best moments were the quiet ones at home. Watching Emma grow, seeing the bond between her and Grace deepen, and knowing I was part of a family, it made everything else seem secondary. One night, after dinner, Grace and I sat together on the couch, talking about how much our lives had changed. "You know," she said, "I never thought my life would turn out like this. I was lost when I met you, and now I have everything I could ever want." "Me too," I said, pulling her close. We didn't need to say much more. Everything we had gone through, every challenge we'd faced, had led us to this point. We had a career we loved, a family that meant everything, and a future that felt bright. Our agency continued to flourish, and as Emma grew older, we found joy in the small moments. Family trips, birthdays, holidays, and the little milestones that mark the passage of time. Watching her become a confident, kind, and intelligent young woman was the greatest reward of all. One of my favorite memories was when Grace and I took Emma to the beach for the first time. She had always loved the water, but this was different. Seeing her run into the ocean, laughing and playing in the waves, was a simple yet profound reminder of how far we had come as a family. Grace and I stood on the shore, watching her, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The work at the agency continued to challenge and fulfill us, but it was the moments with Grace and Emma that truly mattered. Life wasn't about the cases or the money. It was about the people we loved, the family we had built, and the happiness we had found together. There were ups and downs, as there always are, but through it all, Grace, Emma, and I stuck together. We supported each other, laughed together, and faced whatever came our way as a team. Every day was a new adventure, and every day reminded me of just how lucky I was. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, and sometimes, the best things come when you're not looking for them at all. As the years continued to roll by, my life as a private investigator seemed to blend seamlessly into my life as a husband and father. Grace and Emma were now the foundation of everything I did, and our little family had grown into something I hadn't imagined possible all those years ago when I first met Grace. The agency was thriving, and we were well known for handling difficult, complex cases. Yet, despite the professional success, it was the simple, day-to-day moments at home that truly brought me happiness. Emma was now a teenager, and the changes in her were astonishing. Watching her transform from a little girl into a confident, smart, and independent young woman filled me with pride. She excelled in school, had a close group of friends, and was already talking about her future, universities, potential careers, and adventures she wanted to take. Grace and I would often sit down in the evenings after Emma went to bed and reflect on how fast time had flown. It seemed like just yesterday Emma had called me Dad for the first time, and now she was making plans to move away for college. Grace, too, had evolved in ways neither of us could have foreseen. She was now an integral part of the agency, not just behind the scenes managing the office, but also on the front lines. She had taken a keen interest in investigating cases, and over the years, she had developed a remarkable ability to get people to open up to her. There were times when I would be stuck on a lead, unable to break through with a witness or subject, and Grace would step in with her calm demeanor and natural empathy, and suddenly the information we needed would come pouring out. One case, in particular, showcased just how far Grace had come in her role at the agency. It was a missing person case, one that had garnered significant media attention. A prominent local politician's daughter had vanished without a trace, and after weeks of fruitless efforts by the police, the family turned to us. The pressure was immense. Not only was the public eye on this case, but the emotional toll on the family was palpable. They were desperate for answers, and we knew that if we didn't deliver, it could damage our reputation. We started the investigation the way we always did, by retracing the missing girl's steps, interviewing friends and acquaintances, and combing through any available evidence. But the case was unusually difficult. The girl, Rachel, had seemingly vanished into thin air. No one had seen or heard from her in days, and there were no leads to go on. Every person we interviewed seemed to say the same thing. Rachel had been a happy, well-adjusted young woman with no reason to disappear. Her phone had been turned off, her social media accounts untouched, and her credit card hadn't been used since the day she disappeared. Days turned into weeks, and frustration began to build. The pressure from the family and the public was relentless, and even I started to wonder if we'd ever find Rachel. That's when Grace stepped in. She had been quietly reviewing all the interviews and evidence, and something had caught her attention, something I had overlooked. One of Rachel's friends, a girl named Lily, had given a statement that didn't quite add up. She had claimed to have been with Rachel the night before she disappeared, but when Grace dug a little deeper, she realized that Lily's timeline was off. Grace and I decided to pay Lily another visit, and it became clear almost immediately that she was hiding something. Grace took the lead, gently but persistently questioning her, and within minutes, Lily broke down. She confessed that she had lied about the last time she saw Rachel. The truth was, they had gotten into an argument that night, and Rachel had stormed off, upset. Lily hadn't heard from her since, but she hadn't wanted to admit that she and Rachel had fought. This new information changed everything. We now knew Rachel had been upset when she disappeared, which meant there was a possibility she had left on her own. With this in mind, we shifted our focus to searching areas where Rachel might have gone to be alone, places she was known to visit when she needed to clear her head. A week later, we found her. Rachel had taken refuge in a small cabin owned by a family friend, deep in the woods, miles from town. She had gone there to get away from everything, overwhelmed by pressures in her personal life that no one had known about. When we brought her home, the relief on her parents' faces was indescribable. It was one of those rare moments in our line of work where the ending was a happy one, and I knew that it wouldn't have been possible without Grace's insight and intuition. After that case, Grace's confidence soared. She took on more responsibility at the agency, and it wasn't long before clients began requesting her by name. People felt comfortable with her, they trusted her, and she had a way of making even the most reluctant individuals open up. I was proud of her in ways I couldn't put into words. She had become my partner in every sense of the word, both in life and in work. As Emma continued to grow and flourish, she began expressing an interest in following in our footsteps. She had seen the work we did at the agency and had always been fascinated by it. At first, Grace and I were hesitant. The work we did could be dangerous, and we weren't sure if we wanted Emma involved in something that could put her at risk. But Emma was determined. She wanted to learn the ropes, to be a part of the family business, and she was nothing if not persistent. So, we started teaching her. It began with small tasks, helping Lisa in the office, organizing case files, and sitting in on interviews. She took to it quickly, and it wasn't long before she was asking to go out in the field with us. Grace was more nervous about this than I was, but we both agreed to let her shadow us on less risky cases. Emma was a natural. She had inherited her mother's empathy and ability to read people, and she was incredibly observant. It was clear that she had a future in this line of work if she chose to pursue it. One of the first cases Emma worked on with us was a fraud investigation. A local business owner suspected that one of his employees had been embezzling funds, and he hired us to get to the bottom of it. Emma sat in on the interviews, watched us gather evidence, and helped analyze financial records. She was sharp, asking insightful questions and picking up on details that even I missed. By the end of the case, we had enough evidence to confront the employee, and the business owner was able to recover a significant portion of the stolen funds. Emma's involvement in the case had been impressive, and it made me realize just how capable she was. Still, I worried about her getting too involved too soon. This line of work could be emotionally taxing, and I didn't want her to lose the carefree nature that came with being young. But Emma was determined. She wanted to be part of the agency, and I knew I couldn't hold her back forever. Grace and I had many late-night conversations about Emma's future. We both agreed that we would support her in whatever path she chose, but we also wanted to make sure she understood the realities of the work we did. It wasn't always glamorous, and it often required dealing with difficult, sometimes dangerous situations. But Emma was resolute. She had grown up watching us work, and she knew what she was getting into. As Emma prepared for her final years of high school, she started looking at universities, balancing her interest in criminal justice with her passion for helping people. She was leaning towards studying psychology, something that could complement the work we did at the agency. Grace and I couldn't have been more proud. She was turning into a remarkable young woman, and we knew that whatever she decided to do, she would excel at it. Meanwhile, the agency continued to thrive. We had built a reputation as one of the most reliable and discreet investigative firms in the region, and our client base had expanded significantly. With Lisa managing the office, Grace handling much of the investigative work, and Emma learning the ropes, it felt like the agency was truly a family business. But even with the professional success, the real joy in my life came from the quiet moments at home. Grace and I had built a life together that was grounded in love, trust, and mutual respect. Emma was at the center of that life, and watching her grow into a confident, capable young woman filled me with pride every day. There were nights when Grace and I would sit on the porch, just like we used to, watching the stars and talking about the future. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the cool breeze would remind us of how far we had come. We had faced our share of challenges, but we had come through them stronger and more connected than ever. "I can't believe how fast time has gone by," Grace said one evening, her head resting on my shoulder as we rocked gently in our chairs. "I know," I replied. "Feels like just yesterday Emma was starting school, and now she's planning for college." Grace smiled softly. "She's going to do great things, you know? She's so much like you." "She's like both of us," I said. "She's got your heart." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken as the stars grew brighter. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if we hadn't met?" Grace asked quietly. "I try not to," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "I can't imagine my life without you and Emma." Grace sighed contentedly, leaning into me. "I'm glad we found each other." "Me too," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. Life wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges to come, but with Grace and Emma by my side, I knew I could face anything. We had built something real, something lasting, and that was all that mattered. As the years went on, Emma eventually went off to college, studying psychology with a focus on forensic psychology. She stayed involved with the agency during breaks, learning more about the investigative side of things and applying her academic knowledge to real-world situations. Grace and I continued to run the agency, taking on more complex and high-profile cases, but always making time for each other and for Emma. Through it all, one thing remained constant: the love we shared as a family. It was the foundation of everything we did, and it was what made our life together so incredibly fulfilling. As time moved on, so did our lives, with new challenges, triumphs, and the occasional unexpected twist. By now, our agency had reached a level of prominence in the community that I hadn't imagined when I first started out. But the success of the business wasn't the only thing that brought me joy. It was the strength of the bond within our family that truly mattered. Watching Grace grow into her role as both a mother and a partner, and Emma blossoming into a determined young woman, filled my days with a sense of purpose and contentment. Emma was off at college now, fully immersed in her studies in forensic psychology. She had chosen a university with a strong program in both psychology and criminal justice, making it a perfect fit for the path she wanted to take. Grace and I would visit her occasionally, and every time, I was amazed by how much she had grown. She was thriving, academically and personally, and while I missed having her at home, I knew she was doing exactly what she needed to do. Even though Emma was away, she stayed involved with the agency during school breaks. Every summer and winter break, she would come home, eager to dive back into the world of private investigation. Over the years, she had become an integral part of the team, and we trusted her with more significant responsibilities. What started as organizing files and assisting with basic research had grown into much more. Emma now took on interviews, helped track down leads, and even worked on surveillance for some of our cases. She was sharp, intuitive, and driven. All the qualities I knew would make her an excellent investigator if she chose to pursue it full-time. Grace, on the other hand, had become my equal partner in every sense. When we first started working together, I could tell she was nervous, unsure of her place in the agency. But now, she was as much a detective as I was. She had an incredible ability to connect with people, to get them to open up and share details they might not have otherwise. Her empathy and understanding made her invaluable in cases that required a delicate touch, and there were times when I relied on her insights more than my own. One case that sticks out happened about 2 years after Emma left for college. It was a complex case involving a wealthy real estate developer, John Miller, who suspected his business partner, Mark Dawson, of stealing from the company. Miller had come to us after noticing discrepancies in the financial reports and irregularities in several property deals. The sums of money involved were enormous. Millions of dollars had seemingly vanished into thin air. The police had investigated briefly but didn't find enough evidence to pursue the case further, so Miller turned to us. From the outset, it was clear that this wasn't just a simple case of embezzlement. There were layers of deception, and both Miller and Dawson were hiding something. We started by digging into the company's financial records, hiring a forensic accountant to help us trace the missing funds. But as we delved deeper, the story became murkier. Several shell companies were involved, and the money had been funneled through offshore accounts, making it nearly impossible to track. Grace and I worked together on this case, spending countless hours going through documents, interviewing employees, and trying to piece together the puzzle. There were moments when we hit dead ends, but Grace's persistence never wavered. She was convinced there was more to the story than what we were seeing, and her instincts were usually right. One evening, after spending hours reviewing financial statements, Grace pointed out something I had missed. One of the shell companies tied to the missing funds had a connection to Mark Dawson's wife, Linda. This was a crucial breakthrough. Linda Dawson was listed as an executive for one of the companies that had received large sums of money from Miller's real estate firm. It was a link that no one had considered, and it opened up a whole new line of investigation. We shifted our focus to Linda, digging into her background and her involvement in the business. What we uncovered was shocking. Linda had been orchestrating a scheme to siphon money from the company, using her husband's position as a cover. She had created multiple shell companies, moving money around to make it look like legitimate business expenses. Meanwhile, Mark was either completely unaware or willfully ignorant of his wife's activities. The scheme had been going on for years, and the amount of money involved was staggering. With this new information, we approached Miller with our findings. He was both furious and relieved. Furious that his business partner's wife had been stealing from him for so long, but relieved to finally have answers. We handed over our evidence, and Miller immediately filed a lawsuit against Mark and Linda Dawson. The case became a high-profile legal battle, with the media covering it closely. In the end, Miller was able to recover most of the stolen funds, and the Dawsons' reputation was left in ruins. This case was a turning point for our agency. Not only did it solidify our reputation as one of the top investigative firms in the region, but it also proved to me just how invaluable Grace had become. Her attention to detail and her ability to see connections that others missed had been the key to solving the case. It made me realize that I couldn't have done it without her. As the agency continued to grow, so did our family. Emma was now in her final year of college, and she had already begun discussing her plans for the future. She was torn between pursuing a career in forensic psychology or joining the agency full-time. Grace and I told her that whatever path she chose, we would support her, but deep down, I knew Emma's heart was in the agency. She had grown up watching us work, and it had shaped her in ways we hadn't even realized. One evening, after Emma had come home for winter break, the three of us sat around the dinner table talking about the future. Emma had been quiet for most of the meal, which wasn't like her, so I knew something was on her mind. "Emma," I said, putting down my fork, "you've been pretty quiet tonight. What's going on?" She glanced at Grace, then back at me. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do after graduation." Grace smiled gently. "And?" Emma hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I know I've talked about going into forensic psychology, and I'm still interested in it. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that what I really want is to work with you guys. I want to be part of the agency." I couldn't help but smile. "Are you sure? This line of work can be tough, Emma. It's not just about solving puzzles. It's about dealing with people, and sometimes it's not pretty." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "I've seen what you do, and I've been a part of it for years now. I know it's hard, but it's also important work. I want to help people, just like you and Mom do." Grace reached across the table and took Emma's hand. "If that's what you want, we'll support you all the way." And so, Emma officially joined the agency after graduation. She brought a fresh perspective, combining her academic background in psychology with the hands-on experience she had gained working with us. It wasn't long before she was handling her own cases, and clients quickly grew to trust her as much as they did Grace and me. One of Emma's first solo cases was a missing persons investigation. A young woman named Jessica had disappeared, and her family had hired us to find her after the police had exhausted all leads. Emma took the case seriously, poring over every detail and interviewing everyone connected to Jessica's life. She had a natural ability to empathize with people, and it wasn't long before she uncovered a clue the police had missed. Jessica had been in an abusive relationship, something her family hadn't known about. Her boyfriend had a history of controlling behavior, but he had never been violent enough to leave any evidence. Emma's background in psychology allowed her to see the subtle signs of abuse that others had overlooked. She tracked down the boyfriend and managed to get him to admit that he had been keeping tabs on Jessica even after she had left him. Armed with this information, Emma was able to locate Jessica, who had gone into hiding to escape her boyfriend's control. When Emma brought Jessica home to her family, the relief on their faces was overwhelming. It was a moment that solidified Emma's place in the agency. She had proven herself, not just to us but to herself, and I couldn't have been prouder. As time passed, the agency continued to thrive, with all three of us working together as a team. Lisa still managed the office, and we had hired a few additional investigators to help with the growing workload. It felt like we had built something lasting, something meaningful, and I knew that the agency would continue long after I was gone. But no matter how busy we were with work, family always came first. Grace and I made it a point to take time for ourselves, going on weekend getaways, or simply spending quiet evenings at home. Our love had deepened over the years, and I was more grateful than ever to have her by my side. One weekend, Grace and I decided to take a trip to the countryside. It was a chance to escape from the hustle and bustle of the city and reconnect with each other. We rented a small cabin by a lake, and for 3 days, we did nothing but relax, fish, and enjoy each other's company. On the last night of our trip, we sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the cool night air. Grace leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "I love this," she said softly. "Just you and me, away from everything." "Me too," I replied, kissing the top of her head. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustling of the trees. It was moments like these that reminded me of how lucky I was, how far we had come, and how much we had built together. "I've been thinking," Grace said after a while, "maybe it's time for us to take a step back from the agency." I looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've been doing this for years, and while I love the work we do, maybe it's time to start thinking about the future. Emma's doing so well, and we've got a great team in place. Maybe we should start transitioning out, letting Emma and the others take on more responsibility." I considered her words. It wasn't something I had thought about much, but as I sat there by the fire, I realized she was right. We had built something incredible, but we didn't have to carry the full weight of it anymore. Emma was more than capable, and the agency would continue to thrive without us being as hands-on as we had been. "You might be right," I said finally. "Maybe it's time to start stepping back a little." Grace smiled. "We can still be involved, but we don't have to do everything ourselves anymore. We've earned a little rest, don't you think?" "I think you're right," I agreed, pulling her closer. As the fire flickered and the stars shone brightly above us, I realized that life was full of unexpected turns. We had built a family, a business, and a life together that I couldn't have imagined all those years ago. And now, as we looked toward the future, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. As Grace and I approached a new phase in our lives, one marked by stepping back from the day-to-day grind of the agency, I found myself reflecting more on how much our lives had evolved. It wasn't just about the success of our business or watching Emma grow into a confident, capable adult. It was about the journey that had brought us here, the people we'd helped along the way, and the life we'd built together. With Emma now taking on a larger role at the agency and Grace, and I slowly easing our way into semi-retirement, there was a growing sense that things were shifting. We had always thrived on being involved in every detail of the agency's work, but now, As we began to step back, it became clear that the agency could continue to flourish without us being at the center of every case. Emma, now fully immersed in her role, was thriving in ways we hadn't fully anticipated. She had turned out to be an even better investigator than I had hoped, combining her natural empathy and insight into human behavior with a sharp intellect and relentless determination. She was handling some of the agency's most difficult cases, and it was clear she was a leader in the making. It was also clear that Emma was determined to take the agency in new directions, bringing fresh ideas and innovative techniques to the table. One of Emma's most impressive cases was a high-profile corporate espionage investigation that made headlines for weeks. A large tech company, Zenith Enterprises, had come to us after discovering that their cutting-edge software had been leaked to a competitor. The leak had resulted in massive financial losses, and the company's reputation had taken a hit. The CEO, Michael Rivers, was determined to find the mole within his organization, and he turned to our agency for help. Emma took charge of the investigation, and from the very beginning, it was clear this was going to be a complex case. Zenith was a large company with hundreds of employees, many of whom had access to sensitive information. Narrowing down the list of suspects would require not only combing through mountains of digital data, but also conducting interviews and gathering intel on potential suspects within the company. Grace and I acted as consultants, offering advice and insights when needed, but we left the bulk of the work to Emma and the team. We watched with pride as Emma navigated the complexities of the case, using her background in forensic psychology to read between the lines of what people were telling her. After weeks of meticulous investigation, Emma discovered that the leak had come from within the company's legal department. A mid-level lawyer, Darren Walsh, had been secretly feeding information to a rival firm in exchange for a hefty payout. But Emma didn't stop there. She dug deeper and uncovered a more extensive scheme that involved several other employees who had been blackmailing Walsh to keep quiet about his involvement. What had started as a straightforward case of corporate espionage had turned into a full-blown conspiracy. When Emma presented her findings to Michael Rivers, the CEO was blown away. Not only had she identified the mole, but she had also unraveled a network of corruption within the company that would have gone unnoticed otherwise. The investigation led to multiple arrests, and Zenith was able to recover a significant portion of their losses. The media hailed Emma as a rising star in the world of private investigation, and the case cemented her reputation as one of the best in the business. Grace and I couldn't have been prouder. Watching Emma handle such a high-stakes case with professionalism and grace reminded us that the future of the agency was in good hands. She had proven herself time and time again, and we knew that she was more than capable of carrying on the legacy we had built. As we gradually stepped back from the agency, Grace and I found more time to focus on ourselves and each other. We began taking trips we had always talked about but never found the time for. From a romantic getaway to the wine country in California to exploring the coastal towns of New England, we started to rediscover the joys of life outside of work. One of the most memorable trips we took was to the south of France, a place Grace had always dreamed of visiting. We rented a small villa in Provence, surrounded by lavender fields and olive groves. The slow pace of life there was a welcome change from the hectic, fast-paced environment we had become so accustomed to back home. We spent our days wandering through local markets, sampling fresh cheeses and bread, and enjoying long, leisurely meals in the warm Mediterranean sun. In the evenings, we would sit on the terrace of our villa, watching the sun set over the rolling hills, sipping on local wine, and reminiscing about the life we had built together. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Grace said something that stayed with me. "You know," she began, her voice soft but full of emotion, "I never thought my life would turn out like this. There were times when I thought I'd never have a family, never find love. But here we are, and I can't imagine anything more perfect." I took her hand and looked out at the horizon, where the last rays of the sun were fading. "Neither can I," I replied. All of this, is more than I ever dreamed of." Grace smiled and rested her head on my shoulder. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" I nodded. "We really have." Those words stayed with me for the rest of our trip and beyond. As we continued to explore the world together, I found myself reflecting more and more on how much we had built. Not just the agency, but a life filled with love, joy, and deep connection. And while work had always been a big part of our lives, I realized that it was the people we loved, the relationships we had nurtured, that truly defined who we were. Back home, things continued to move forward. The agency was thriving under Emma's leadership, and our team had grown to include several talented investigators who shared our commitment to excellence. Grace and I remained involved, but it was clear that Emma was taking the reins, and we were happy to let her. As the months passed, Grace and I found ourselves settling into a new rhythm. We spent more time at home, enjoying the little things, cooking meals together, gardening, taking long walks in the nearby park. It was a peaceful, contented life, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything. But life has a way of surprising you, even when you think you've got everything figured out. It was a warm summer evening when Emma came over for dinner. She had been busy with a new case, but we hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks, so we were eager to catch up. As we sat around the dining room table, sharing stories and laughter, I noticed that Emma seemed more distracted than usual. "Everything okay?" I asked, giving her a concerned look. Emma glanced at Grace, then back at me. "Actually, there's something I need to tell you both." Grace and I exchanged a worried glance. "What is it, sweetheart?" Grace asked, her voice gentle. Emma took a deep breath. "I've been offered a job, a really good one. It's with the FBI." I blinked, not sure I had heard her correctly. "The FBI?" Emma nodded. "Yeah, they've been following my work, especially the Zenith case, and they want me to join their behavioral analysis unit." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. This was huge. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was one of the most prestigious and highly specialized divisions in law enforcement. It was a dream job for anyone in the field of forensic psychology, and I knew Emma had always admired their work. But it also meant that she would be leaving the agency and us. Grace was the first to speak. "That's an amazing opportunity, Emma. You must be thrilled." Emma smiled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I am, but I don't want to leave you guys. The agency. It's been my whole life." I leaned forward, taking her hand in mine. "Emma, you've earned this. You've worked hard for this, and if this is what you want, you should go for it. The agency will be fine. But what about you and Mom?" Emma asked, her voice wavering slightly. "I don't want to disappoint you." Grace shook her head. "Sweetheart, you could never disappoint us. We're so proud of you, and we'll support you no matter what you decide. This is your chance to do something incredible." Emma's eyes filled with emotion, and she squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. I love working with you both. It's been such a huge part of who I am. And it always will be," I assured her. "The agency will always be here. But you've got to follow your own path." Over the next few weeks, Emma wrestled with the decision, but in the end, she accepted the FBI's offer. Grace and I were beyond proud of her, but there was also a sense of bittersweetness in knowing that she was moving on to the next chapter of her life. The agency would continue, of course, but it wouldn't be the same without Emma's daily presence. On her last day at the agency, the team threw her a farewell party. There were tears, hugs, and words of encouragement as we all celebrated her new adventure. Emma gave a heartfelt speech, thanking everyone for their support and promising to stay in touch. And then, just like that, she was off to Quantico, ready to begin her training with the FBI. The transition wasn't easy for Grace and me. We had spent so many years building the agency and working side by side with Emma that her absence left a noticeable void. But life has a way of moving forward, even when it seems like you've reached a place of perfect peace. Grace and I had settled into our quieter life, enjoying the fruits of our years of hard work and watching from the sidelines as Emma built her career with the FBI. The agency we had poured so much of ourselves into was thriving, now managed by a capable team and sustained by the reputation we had established. While I no longer felt the constant pull of the day-to-day operations, there was still a small part of me that missed the intensity of the investigations, the adrenaline that came from solving a case, and the satisfaction of knowing that we had helped someone find answers. But with Emma gone and our team taking on more responsibility, Grace and I found ourselves with more free time than we had ever had before. We had traveled, we had spent time with friends and family, and we had embraced the quiet moments at home. Yet, even in our newfound leisure, I could sense that we were both wondering what the next chapter of our lives would look like. It wasn't long after Emma's departure to Quantico that we received a phone call from an old friend, someone we hadn't heard from in years, but whose name instantly brought back a flood of memories. It was Jack Monroe, a retired detective I had worked with during my early days as a police officer. Jack and I had stayed in touch over the years, but as time passed and we both pursued different careers, our communication had dwindled to the occasional holiday card or email. Jack had always been the kind of guy who kept things close to the vest, so when he called out of the blue, I knew it had to be something important. "Ben, I need your help," he said after a few minutes of catching up. The tone in his voice was enough to tell me that whatever he was dealing with wasn't just a casual request. Jack had always been the type of detective who could handle anything that came his way, so for him to reach out like this meant something serious was going on. "What's going on, Jack?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair, already sensing that this conversation was going to pull me back into the world I had been stepping away from. "There's a case, an old case that's come back to haunt me," he said, his voice tight. "I thought it was closed, but now, things are happening. Things that don't make sense." I glanced at Grace, who was sitting across from me, listening intently. She gave me a look that said she already knew where this was heading. "Tell me about it," I said, my curiosity piqued. Jack sighed heavily before continuing. "You remember the Wilson case? The one that ended in that big shootout back in '95? I nodded. How could I forget? It was one of the most high-profile cases we had worked on back when I was still with the force. The Wilsons were a wealthy family who had been caught up in a web of lies, betrayal, and murder. The case had culminated in a dramatic standoff that resulted in the deaths of two of the suspects and the arrest of a third, John Wilson, the family patriarch. It was a case that had made headlines for weeks and had left a lasting mark on all of us who were involved. "Yeah, I remember," I said. "What about it?" "John Wilson died in prison a couple of months ago," Jack said. "Heart attack, apparently. But ever since then, strange things have been happening. His daughter, Charlotte, has been receiving threats, anonymous letters, phone calls in the middle of the night. And then last week, she was attacked outside her house. She wasn't seriously hurt, but whoever did it left a message. It said, 'The past is never dead.'" I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's cryptic." "Yeah," Jack agreed. "And that's not all. I've been getting phone calls too, blocked numbers, no one on the other end. And then there was this package I received. It was full of old case files, documents, photos, things that should have been sealed away years ago. What do you think it means?" I asked. "I don't know," Jack admitted, "but I've got a bad feeling about this. I think someone's trying to stir up the past, and I don't know why. I've tried reaching out to some of the old crew, but most of them have either retired or moved on. You're the only one I trust to help me figure this out." I leaned back in my chair, considering the weight of what Jack was asking. It had been years since I'd worked a case like this, and part of me wondered if I was ready to jump back into that world. But at the same time, the idea of solving a mystery, of helping a friend in need, reignited something inside me, a spark that had never truly gone out. "All right," I said after a moment. "I'll help you, but we need to be careful. If someone's targeting Charlotte and bringing up old cases, we don't know what they're capable of." Jack let out a breath of relief. "Thanks, Ben. I knew I could count on you. Can you come down to see me? We can go over everything in person." "Yeah, I'll be there," I said. "Just give me the details." After hanging up the phone, I looked over at Grace. She had been silent throughout the conversation, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Jack needs help," I said, explaining the situation to her. Grace listened carefully, and when I finished, she nodded slowly. "It sounds serious." "It is," I agreed. "And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better." Grace sighed, her expression thoughtful. "You know I'll support you, whatever you decide. But just be careful. This sounds like the kind of case that could dig up a lot of old wounds." "I know," I said, reaching for her hand. "But Jack's a friend, and if someone's threatening Charlotte, we can't just sit back and do nothing." Grace squeezed my hand, her eyes softening. "Then we'll figure it out together." A few days later, I found myself driving down to meet Jack. The town hadn't changed much since I'd last been there. The same streets, the same old buildings, but something felt different, a sense of unease that lingered in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be more complicated than I had anticipated. When I arrived at Jack's house, he greeted me at the door, looking older and more tired than I remembered. His once dark hair was now streaked with gray, and there were deep lines etched into his face that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him. But despite the wear and tear, his eyes still held that same sharpness, the same determination that had made him one of the best detectives I'd ever known. "Good to see you, Ben," he said, pulling me into a brief hug. "You too, Jack," I replied, stepping inside. His house was cluttered with old case files, newspaper clippings, and photographs. It was clear that Jack had been living and breathing this case for weeks, maybe even months. He led me into the living room, where a large corkboard was set up, covered in notes, photos, and strings connecting various pieces of information. "You've been busy," I said, glancing at the board. "Too busy," Jack muttered. "This thing has been eating away at me." He handed me a folder filled with documents. "Take a look at this. These are some of the files I received. They're all from the Wilson case, stuff that should have been locked away in evidence storage. But someone got their hands on them." I flipped through the folder, recognizing some of the photos and reports from the original investigation. Whoever had sent these files clearly had access to sensitive information, which only added to the mystery. "Have you been able to trace where these came from?" I asked. Jack shook his head. "No return address, no fingerprints. Whoever sent them knew what they were doing." I set the folder down and looked at Jack. "So, what's our next move?" Jack rubbed his temples, looking exhausted. "I've been trying to track down Charlotte, but she's gone off the grid since the attack. I think she's scared, and I don't blame her. I've reached out to some of her friends, but no one seems to know where she is. Do you think she's in real danger?" I asked. "I do," Jack said grimly. "If someone's willing to attack her in broad daylight, who knows what they'll do next? Then we need to find her before they do," I said. We spent the next few hours going over the details of the case, revisiting old leads, and trying to piece together who might have a motive for targeting Charlotte. The Wilson case had been complicated, with multiple players involved, and there were plenty of people who had reasons to want revenge or closure. But narrowing down the list of suspects wasn't easy. By the time I left Jack's house, my head was spinning with possibilities. Whoever was behind this had been planning it for a long time, and they were clearly playing a dangerous game. But what was their end goal? Why stir up the past now, after all these years? As I drove back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything click into place. But until we found Charlotte, we were operating in the dark. Over the next few days, Grace and I worked tirelessly to track down Charlotte. We followed leads, reached out to contacts, and even enlisted the help of some of our former colleagues. But no matter where we looked, it seemed like Charlotte had vanished without a trace. Then, one night, I received a phone call. "Ben?" The voice on the other end was shaky, almost panicked. "Charlotte," I said, immediately recognizing her voice. "Yes, it's me," she said, her voice trembling. "I need help. I'm in trouble. Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm at a motel, outside of town," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do. They're watching me." "I'm coming to get you," I said, grabbing my car keys. "Stay where you are, and don't open the door for anyone." Grace looked up from the kitchen table as I rushed toward the door. "What's going on?" "It's Charlotte," I said. "She's in trouble. I've got to go." Grace stood up, her face filled with concern. "Be careful, Ben." "I will," I promised before heading out the door. The drive to the motel felt like it took forever, even though it was only about 20 minutes away. My mind raced with questions. Who was after Charlotte? Why had she gone into hiding? And what did she mean when she said they were watching her? When I arrived at the motel, the parking lot was nearly empty. I found Charlotte's room and knocked lightly on the door. "It's me," I said. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and Charlotte peered out at me with wide, frightened eyes. She looked disheveled, like she hadn't slept in days, and there was a cut on her cheek that hadn't been there the last time I saw her. "Come in," she whispered, opening the door wider. I stepped inside, and she quickly locked the door behind me. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking in her disheveled appearance. Charlotte shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I'm not okay. I'm scared, Ben. Someone's been following me, and I don't know who it is or what they want. They attacked me outside my house, and I've been on the run ever since. Have you gone to the police?" I asked. Charlotte shook her head again. "No, I don't trust them. Last time, they didn't believe me, and I'm not going through that again." I nodded, understanding her reluctance. The police hadn't exactly been helpful during the original investigation, and I could see why she'd be hesitant to involve them now. "Okay," I said, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now. We'll figure this out." As I sat down with Charlotte, listening to her recount everything that had happened since her father's death, I realized that this case was far from over. Someone was determined to drag the past into the present, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But what exactly did they want? That was the question we had to answer, and fast. Charlotte's words echoed in my mind as I drove back home that night. "They're watching me." Someone had gone to great lengths to target her, and it was clear that this wasn't a case of random harassment. This was deliberate, and whoever was behind it was willing to do more than just scare her. They'd already attacked her once, and there was no telling what they'd do next. I arrived home late, the house quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. Grace was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open and papers spread out in front of her. She had that focused look I knew so well, the look of someone deep in thought, searching for a missing piece to the puzzle. "How's Charlotte?" she asked, looking up as I entered the room. "Scared," I said, sitting down across from her. "She's been on the run for days. Someone's been following her, and she's convinced they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Grace nodded slowly, tapping her fingers on the table. "It sounds like whoever this is has a vendetta. This isn't just about John Wilson's death. It's something deeper." "I think you're right," I said, "but we need to figure out what they're after. Charlotte doesn't know why they're targeting her, and we're running out of time. She's not safe out there, and I'm worried that if we don't act fast, they'll come after her again." Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've been going over the Wilson case, trying to see if there's anything we missed. Something that could explain why this is all happening now, years after the case was closed." I glanced at the stack of papers on the table. It was a mixture of old case files, newspaper articles, and notes from our conversations with Jack. Grace had clearly been busy while I was out. "Find anything?" I asked, leaning forward. "Maybe," she said, reaching for a specific document. "Do you remember this?" I took the paper from her and scanned it quickly. It was a report from the original investigation, a list of assets and properties owned by John Wilson at the time of his arrest. Most of the items on the list were typical for a man of his wealth: multiple homes, luxury cars, offshore accounts. But one item stood out: a small, nondescript property listed under a shell company, located in a remote area outside the city. "I vaguely remember this," I said. "It wasn't considered important at the time. The property wasn't connected to the main investigation, and there was no evidence that it had been used for anything illegal." Grace nodded. "That's what I thought too. But the thing is, that property was never fully investigated. The police were focused on Wilson's more prominent assets, and this one slipped through the cracks. I did some digging, and it turns out that the shell company that owned the property is still active." I frowned, feeling a sense of unease settle in my stomach. "You think the property could be connected to what's happening now?" "It's possible," Grace said. "If this property was used to hide something that wasn't uncovered during the original investigation, it could explain why someone's targeting Charlotte now. Maybe there's something there that they don't want anyone to find." I stared at the document, my mind racing. "It's worth checking out." Grace closed her laptop and stood up. "I agree. We need to see what's at that property. If there's anything there that can give us answers, we'll find it." The next morning, I made arrangements to head out to the property. I reached out to Jack, filling him in on what Grace had discovered, and he agreed to meet us there. It was a remote location, far enough from the city that it was unlikely anyone would stumble upon it by accident. If something had been hidden there, it could have easily gone unnoticed for years. Grace and I set out early, driving through the quiet countryside as the sun rose over the horizon. The farther we drove, the more isolated the landscape became, with nothing but open fields and dense woods stretching out in every direction. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear and no one would ever know. As we neared the location, my phone buzzed with a message from Jack. He was already at the property, waiting for us. We pulled off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that led deep into the woods. After about 10 minutes of navigating the rough terrain, we spotted Jack's car parked near a rundown cabin. "This must be the place," I said, pulling up next to Jack's car. We stepped out of the car, the air cool and crisp, and made our way toward the cabin where Jack was standing. The property was surrounded by overgrown vegetation, and the cabin itself looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were boarded up, and the roof was sagging in places, but it was still standing. "Good to see you," Jack said as we approached. "I've already taken a look around, but there's nothing obvious. The place is pretty run down. Any signs that someone's been here recently?" Grace asked, glancing around. Jack shook his head. "No fresh tracks, no signs of movement. If this place is connected to the threats, whoever's been here has done a good job of covering their tracks." I looked at the cabin, my instincts telling me that there was more to this place than met the eye. "Let's take a closer look." We made our way to the front door, which was padlocked shut. Jack produced a set of bolt cutters from his bag and quickly snapped the lock, allowing us to push the door open. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, the smell of damp wood filling the air. Dust covered every surface, and it was clear that no one had lived here in a long time. Grace and I began to search the cabin while Jack checked the surrounding property. We moved through each room carefully, looking for anything that might give us a clue as to why this place had been important to John Wilson, and why someone was so intent on keeping it a secret. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with only a few old chairs and a table in the main room. A rusted wood stove sat in the corner, and used for years. The kitchen was similarly empty, with nothing but a few cracked plates and utensils left behind. It wasn't until we reached the bedroom at the back of the cabin that we found something unusual. The room was as empty as the others, except for a large wardrobe pushed up against the far wall. It was an old, heavy piece of furniture, and something about its placement struck me as odd. It seemed out of place, almost like it had been moved there to hide something. Grace must have noticed it too, because she immediately walked over to it and began inspecting the floor around the wardrobe. "This doesn't belong here," she said. "Look at the scuff marks on the floor. It's been moved recently." I moved to her side and helped push the wardrobe away from the wall. Sure enough, behind it was a small door, hidden in the wood paneling. The door was locked, but the lock itself was old and rusted. It didn't take much effort to pry it open. We exchanged a glance before pulling the door open, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading down into a dark basement. "Looks like we found something," I said, reaching for my flashlight. We descended the stairs slowly, the air growing colder and damper as we went. The basement was small, with low ceilings and concrete walls. It looked like it had been used for storage at some point, with old crates and boxes stacked against the walls. But what caught my attention was a large metal safe tucked into the corner of the room. "Well, that's interesting," Grace said, eyeing the safe. I nodded, walking over to it. "Let's see what's inside." The safe was locked, but Jack had joined us by this point, and with his help, we managed to crack it open. Inside was a collection of documents, old photographs, and what appeared to be legal papers. There was also a small, black notebook that immediately caught my attention. I picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages. It was filled with handwritten notes, cryptic messages, dates, and names. The more I read, the more I realized that this was no ordinary notebook. It seemed to detail a series of transactions and meetings that involved some very powerful people. "This is it," I said, holding up the notebook. "This is what they've been hiding." Grace leaned over my shoulder, her eyes scanning the pages. "What is it?" "It's a record," I said, "of every illegal deal John Wilson ever made. Payoffs, bribes, blackmail. It's all here. And it names names. Big names." Jack looked at the notebook, his face pale. "If this gets out, it explains everything," I said. "Someone doesn't want this information to see the light of day." and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure it stays buried. We spent the next few hours combing through the documents and photographs we had found, piecing together the web of corruption that John Wilson had been involved in. It was clear that this wasn't just about one man's crimes. It was about a network of people who had been complicit in his actions, people who had a lot to lose if the truth came out. As we packed up the evidence and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now in even more danger than before. We had uncovered something that went far beyond the threats against Charlotte. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power, and we had just scratched the surface. That night, as we sat around Jack's kitchen table, we discussed our next steps. The information we had found was explosive, but it was also dangerous. If we weren't careful, we could find ourselves in the crosshairs of the very people we were trying to expose. We need to be smart about this, I said. We can't just hand this over to the authorities and hope for the best. We need a plan. Jack nodded, his expression grim. Agreed. This isn't just about bringing people to justice. It's about protecting ourselves and Charlotte. Grace, who had been quiet for most of the discussion, spoke up. What if we go public with it? Release the information to the media? I considered her suggestion. It was risky, but it might be our best shot at exposing the truth. If we could get the information out in the open, it would be harder for anyone to cover it up or silence us. It's an option, I said, but we need to make sure we're protected. Once this goes public, we'll be targets. We spent the next few days preparing for the fallout. We contacted a trusted journalist, someone we knew wouldn't be intimidated or bought off, and arranged for the documents to be released. We also took steps to ensure our own safety, hiring additional security, keeping a low profile, and making sure Charlotte was safe. When the story finally broke, it made headlines around the country. The corruption we had uncovered sent shockwaves through the political and business world, leading to multiple investigations and resignations. It wasn't long before arrests were made, and the people responsible for the threats against Charlotte were brought to justice. But even as the dust settled, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only uncovered part of the truth. There were still unanswered questions, still loose ends that needed tying up, and I knew that this was far from over. As Grace and I sat on our porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. We had faced danger before, but this felt different. This time, we had gone up against powerful forces that wouldn't hesitate to come after us if we got in their way again. But despite the risks, I felt a sense of peace. We had done what was right, and we had helped Charlotte find safety. And for now, that was enough. Grace leaned her head against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "What do you think happens next?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." We sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the world momentarily lifted from our shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm, knowing that we had done everything we could to protect the people we cared about. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden light, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we were ready to face them together.